And he includes this quote in his work. And in this quote, Ibn Khaldun, rahimahullah, he says, "The vanquished always want to imitate the victor in his distinctive characteristics, his dress, his occupation, and all his other conditions and customs. The reason for this is that the soul always sees perfection in the person who is superior to it and to whom it is subservient. It considers him perfect, either because it is impressed by the respect it has for him, or because it erroneously assumes that its own subservience to him is not due to the nature of defeat, but to the perfection of the victor." Now, I think this statement itself would strike a lot of us as very obvious, that when people are in a position of dominance, they're able to exert themselves on people who are weaker or disenfranchised in various ways and get them to adjust the way they see the world. But I'd say the bigger question for us is, what does it mean to be the victor, and what does it mean to be vanquished? It's very interesting if you study early Muslim history, especially when Islam begins expanding. There are a couple of good scholars that write about this. Sidney Griffith, who was at Catholic University, I don't know if he's retired. He has a couple of books. He has the Church in the Shadow of the Mosque. He also has the beginning of Christian theology in Arabic. There are a couple of good books on the development of early sort of Christianity and Christian theology in the Arabic-speaking world. And he talks about Islam entering into regions that were solidly Christian. Right, sort of the Shami regions. These were solidly Christian places when Muslims entered there. And the idea is, how does a place go from being 95% Christian plus to being pretty much dominated by Islam? And one of the arguments he makes in the book is that at times Christian scholars erroneously or mistakenly assume that Muslims came in and simply imposed themselves through the sword, or that the jizya, sort of the poll tax, was just so impositional that people said, you know what, the heck with this, I don't want to have to pay a little more money to be a Christian, I'm just going to become a Muslim. But what he said is, it's really a function of the soft power of society, that when you have a culture that is simply suffused with a specific attitude, when it reflects a particular worldview, people get assimilated into it over time. And so you have masjids being built, and you have Muslim iconography that's filling the streets. You have the adhan going off 5 times a day. The language has shifted now into Arabic, and prior to that point, you had no Christian theological doctrine in Arabic. Right? One of the very, very interesting things about early Christian Arabic writing is how dependent they are on Muslim terms. Extremely dependent on Muslim terms. Theodore Abu Qurra is an early Arabophone Christian. He has a book, his Mayamir. John Lamar Yu translated them. And so you can find it in English, but he begins, when he's talking about the Trinity, he has to use terms like hulul, sort of incarnationism and things like that, because there's no normative vocabulary to express the Trinity yet. So he's trying to provide something that his own community can comprehend, while they're being sort of assaulted by this Muslim society just because of what they're in. And so all of this is taken, people are giving salams to one another. When they talk about when they're going to meet one another, they say, oh, we'll meet after Maghrib or before Isha. They're not Muslim, but they're ingratiated in a Muslim society. And they're part and parcel of it. And everything that society does is reflected in it. Eid is celebrated in the streets. Ramadan is something that's unmistakable. If you're not part of it, you feel left out. You feel left out. And again, this is something that happened in just about every place Muslims spread to. If you look at Al-Andalus and you look at the history of Muslim Spain, right? Tariq ibn Ziyad, it was 711. He enters, Gibraltar, right? The Jabal Tariq. 711, he entered there. So we're talking about, early 8th century that Islam begins to spread in Islamic Spain. Lasts until the 15th century. And there are a couple of good books if you're interested in this topic. L.P. Harvey has a two-volume set on the history of Islamic Spain. And there's a really depressing part, which is towards the end, when you start seeing the decline of the Muslim empire. And he talks about some of the policies that this sort of ascending Christian polity begins to enact in what was previously a dominant Muslim society. And so they begin to ban public Muslim practice. They begin to convert masjids into churches aggressively, right? The sha'air of Islam begin to get taken down in a very rapid format, because the idea is that so long as this much Islam exists, it exists as a threat to the Christian community and their ability to take this over. And there's a very depressing part of the work that he ends the 2 volumes with. And in it he records a story of one of the last khutbahs that we have recorded in Al-Andalus. One of the last khutbahs that we have. And I forgot the gentleman's name, the person's name who gave the khutbah. But by this point, there are no masjids left. They've all been converted, and the public practice of Islam has been banned. The individual who's leading the khutbah comes from a descendancy of nobility, fuqaha, and scholars. He's been allowed to stay there because he has relationships to people in power, and they've permitted him belonging. He's delivering this khutbah in his home. There are 4 people in attendance, 4 men, and his daughter is in attendance, and his daughter has been widowed because her husband passed away in prior revolts. And this khutbah is just a heart-wrenching khutbah to just read. You're just reading it on the page, and he's talking about, what are we going to stand in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and say? He just keeps repeating, like, how are we going to stand and meet the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam on the Day of Judgment? And he, towards the end of the khutbah, he says, what hurts most is that the Muslims left here will be just like the Christians. They will not reject their dress, and they will not avoid their food. So given time, they're just going to get assimilated, and there's going to be no Islam left in these lands. So in this and other historical events, we see a dramatic shift. It feels that way to us because they were reading them on paper. In reality, these things took time. They took decades, sometimes centuries. And like that, we have the world in front of us today that continues to impinge on us in various ways. And we're beginning to see a number of those adjustments simply working in the reverse. We're beginning to see those things work in the reverse, where the Muslim community is now being imposed upon by a dominant culture, a dominant political arrangement, and a dominant society that presents to it a particular worldview and says, this is what's normal, this is what's correct. If we read the data, we see all of that being confirmed. A Pew report recently, I want to say it was last year, said that on an annual basis now, 25% of the Muslim community in America annually is electing to leave Islam. So you're talking about 1 in 4 Muslims now that either explicitly apostate from the faith or apostatize, or they just sort of quietly walk out of the community. In a recent article, and this is an interesting one, it was talking about rates of intermarriage. So the rates at which Muslims are marrying outside of the Muslim community. And the title of the article was, Muslims Are the New Jews, of the title of the piece. And it's because if you look at non-Christian religions in this country, Jews have the highest percentage of intermarriage after Christians. Jews have the highest rates. And Muslims are actually right behind them now. So Muslims marry outside of their religion more than Hindus, more than Sikhs, more than Buddhists, more than any other religious community as a minority, right? Christians, they almost don't count because there's no Sharia there really, for the most part, when it comes to these types of things. But for us, it's obviously quite damaging and daunting to realize how many Muslims are marrying outside of the community. And empirically and anecdotally, this is something we observe quite a bit now. Where we get invited to a wedding and the groom or the bride is not Muslim. And sometimes it can put us in difficult circumstances or situations. What are we supposed to do with this, right? And the types of things that used to place pressure on those types of arrangements being fulfilled don't really seem to matter, right? The fact that an imam's not going to come and do the ceremony, I mean, who cares, right? You can still have a couple of dances, music, some nice food. It's a night, right? That's all it is to people. And so the idea is that these things are becoming a lot more common for us. Another statistic, another survey recently showed that Muslims, when it comes to the issue of homosexuality, have now more favorable attitudes on that subject than a number of Christian groups and a number of Christian denominations. Again, which shows just how liberalized the Muslim community is. And that's quite radical if you think about it. It's very radical. Because it means that the majority of the Muslim community today, at least in sort of the political sense, has moved further to the left than Barack Obama was in his first term, right? I mean, like 6 years ago. And yet the majority of the Muslim community has moved further along on that issue. And inshallah, we'll spend a lot of time on that issue tomorrow. For many of us, for some of us, I should say, we don't really feel these shifts because you go to work, you come home, you go to the masjid, you have parking problems in Salatul Jum'ah, the Taraweeh is still full, and so you feel like everything's okay, right? There are certain things you dislike, you see Donald Trump on TV and he's just irritating, right? But when we take a minute to just reflect on the way in which society has changed in our own community, forget on the outside, just our own community, these things come into focus very rapidly. If you look at Muslim conferences and the way that Muslim conferences and sort of major Muslim conferences have shifted over the past couple of years, there are a couple of features that are quite concerning. The first is the fact that there are fewer and fewer scholars that actually get invited to conferences. Once a time where you would attend a conference, it would just about be exclusively talab al-ilm and ulama, right? You'd have people of knowledge that dominated these conferences. And people went there expecting to hear people of knowledge. Now, oftentimes, people of knowledge are a sideshow. They're in poorly attended side sessions, and they're increasingly just uninvited. Some of the largest events, the most popular events that occur in the Muslim community no longer require participation from anyone that actually has knowledge, especially in the Shari'i sense. And if those people are invited, they're invited just in a ceremonial capacity. They'll begin the event by doing a dua or close it with that. They may offer a few words here and there, but the program can go on without them. Right? If you look at who's keynoting these events, again, it's increasingly people who are politically active in social justice spaces. And sometimes those people are advocating things that contradict the deen. But again, those things don't seem to matter as much anymore. If you look at topics that dominate our internal discourse and the way that we look at them, again, this is a very, very concerning trend. I was talking to Sheikh Farhan earlier and I was recounting an incident. This was a few years ago, not very long ago. And there was a brother local to where I live. Don't look it up, but this brother had gone on a trip. It was sort of a Zionist-funded trip, and he had gone to Israel. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the MLI. It wasn't MLI, it was a trip like MLI. I don't remember the name of the trip. And, people were really outraged, right? And, I guess understandably so, right? They were upset. There was an element of tokenizing and faith washing, and all of those things were coming up. And, the article was being shared. People were very upset at this brother for selling the Palestinian community up the creek. And I read the article, and very early in the article, there was a picture of this brother in Israel. He's in Jerusalem, and he's at the Wailing Wall. And he has a yarmulke on his head, and he's holding like a prayer book, and his head is on the Wailing Wall, and he has a tear coming down. And he describes that as one of the most powerful prayers he's ever done in his entire life, right? Participating in this Jewish prayer. And I remember thinking to myself, subhanAllah, all these people are talking about this article. Everybody's read this thing. And no one has an issue with this. Like no one seemed to have a single issue with this. The fact this is a prayer of another religion that a Muslim is participating in. And that almost didn't register. And I don't think, and it's instructive because oftentimes these things aren't done deliberately. But it's the fact that they're not done deliberately. It's the fact that it's the intuitions through which people have been conditioned to see the world that has made religion, that has made belief, that has made practice such an insignificant thing in our lives. And as Muslims, that has to be very, very concerning for us. I see this and I feel this oftentimes when we see events and we see tragedies in the world. And those can be very heart-wrenching things to think about when we see tragedies that have taken place. And we see people who are going through difficulties, sometimes the Muslim community in different places, Yemen and China and everywhere else. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make things easy for them and help them in their time of need and give them assistance over those who oppress them. But when the Prophet ﷺ and the Muslim community went through difficulties, when they were being surrounded, it wasn't just about, hey, let's just pool our money together, right? Ittikhad al-asbab, yes, right? But part of those asbab is remembering, part of the means is remembering the one who controls the means. Musabbib al-asbab, right? And so there was qunut, that the Prophet ﷺ would make dua in his prayer, a special dua when they were going through difficulties, right? I asked myself, where is this, right? If people care so much about these people, why don't they wake up at night and make dua for them? Why do they think their $10 that they're donating or $100 means more than asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the last third of the night? Who's convinced them of that? Who has convinced them that doing that is going to be more effective than appealing to the one who controls this entire world, who can change the circumstances of anybody in a moment? And it's not hard for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to do. It's not difficult for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And yet, that's almost looked at as a useless activity. A useless activity. I remember recently there was a shooting somewhere. It was this may have been last year. And there was one of those sort of trying to be funny, cheeky articles on the Huffington Post. And it was authored by Neil deGrasse Tyson, the famous atheist. And he was mocking the notion of, we'll keep them in our thoughts and prayers. Generally politicians will say it, and I get it, it's like a cliche, right? They don't, the problem there is they don't really mean it, right? But he talked about, the title of the article was something along the lines of, the statistics around the number of people whose lives have been saved through thoughts and prayers. And he had like a chart, and he was going back like millennia, and it was just like zero the entire time. Right? It was just zero. And this is a very popular publication, right? I mean, Muslims look to the Huffington Post as an ally. And yet that's the type of material that they're being exposed to. That's the type, just this atheistic and naturalistic, hedonistic junk, right? Being shoved down our throats and telling us that prayer doesn't make a difference. Telling us that we ourselves, of our own means in our own hands, can change anything, and that we don't need Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in our lives. We feel these struggles when we talk to our youth at times. They talk about how irrelevant everything is. They make us feel like we need to shift the way we're talking and the way we're thinking about things. And I talk about the shifts of society around us in our own community. One of the things that's really striking to me now, and I don't go to the mall often, but usually during busy season, Q4, right, in the calendar year, if you go after the Thanksgiving time, especially when sort of the Christmas stuff is set up, now it's not even surprising anymore to see Muslims in line with their children to get pictures with Santa, right? They're just sort of there, muhajjaba, and this. You just see that, right? And they're just small things, but they are indicative. They're symptomatic of a sense that what you have today is a regnant culture that you look at and you admire. And you hate the notion of having to be different. You feel like difference is not something that you've been asked to be. And you think about your career aspirations, you think about your social mobility, you think about trying to be normal. I look at our MSAs, and the way MSAs have changed just dramatically in the last 2 decades. Right? Some MSAs are still, mashallah, holding it together, but others are very, very far gone now throughout the country. Some are very far gone. I remember I remember when I was in college, and we were a bit unique, granted. You know, we were kind of strict, yani. I remember there was an international week on campus, and as part of international week, they had flags from different countries hanging from the top of our student center. And we had drafted a letter internally as the MSA to send to the administration of the university saying that there were a couple of flags, like the Iraqi flag and the Saudi flag. We said the name of Allah is on them, they should be higher. Like it's like they can't all be at the same level, right? Like that was really like something that we did, right? Which granted, you know, in Hayth al-Hikmah, I don't know if that was the right move, right? But you still get the idea that was, I mean, back then, if I were to talk about that, at that time period, a lot of MSAs were still sort of in that world, right? You know, Islam Awareness Week was really about teaching people about the deen, right? There was a lot of competition around getting scholars to come in, right? Plenty of MSAs were reaching out, even to local scholars, right? In Northern Virginia, I went to school in Northern Virginia. I can tell you the majority of our programs and classes, which were well attended, were just by local imams. Wallahi, these brothers just volunteering their time, driving sometimes an hour plus, just to come for an hour to teach seerah. And we just took for granted that like 40, 50 people are going to show up to this. That was a common thing. If you look at our cultural icons on the outside, it makes our challenges more daunting, right? Aziz Ansari is like a prominent comedian now. You know, Muslims look up to Aziz Ansari, and irritates me, right? But he's an open atheist, openly pronounces his atheist. And just no respect for Islam at all. He talks about his love for different types of wine, how much he eats bacon, his philandering with women. I mean, this is just part of his public profile. It's just part of his public Aslan. Raza Aslan writes books about Islam. He writes books about the Prophet ﷺ. And yet he goes on TV on his own show and literally eats human brain. This isn't like a metaphor for something else. This is him literally eating the dead remains of a human being on TV. And what type of role models are these people? For so long we've been talking to our community about the importance of us having a symbolic presence, for us being in the media, for us being on television. And here we are, we have plenty of Muslims now on television. We have plenty of Muslims that are writing and in the media. But the question is, what type of Muslims do we have there? Is this anything to be proud of? Is this anything to be proud of for us as a community? Entertainers, politicians, musicians, Muslim celebrities, they help provide us a means to integrate. It's an easy conversation topic for us to have with others. They help us feel normal, just like everyone else, but they do so by betraying any notion of what it means to be a Muslim. By betraying any means to be a Muslim. One of the acute difficulties that we have today is the way in which we're starting to talk about being a Muslim. That being a Muslim is just an identity. It brings us into conversation with the community. This whole notion of just we're working for the Muslim community this, the Muslim community that. What does it mean for us to have a Muslim community? What does it mean for us to be Muslims? It means we've submitted ourselves to something. It means that there are beliefs that undergird and inform that title. من أحسن قولا ممن دعا إلى الله وعمل صالحا وقال إنني من المسلمين. وقال إنني من المسلمين. Right? That who's better in speech than the one who calls to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and does good works and says, I'm from the Muslims. This comes with responsibilities. There's a definition of what Islam is. If someone doesn't subscribe to it, they're not Muslim. The idea that we're just sort of interested in this community advance, well, what about God? What about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Why is it becoming increasingly rare for us to actually refer to the Quran and the Sunnah? I remember one time I was speaking to a brother and he was he was Jewish, I was speaking to a friend, and there was a Jewish person who was there, and this Jewish individual was from overseas. I think he was like a Yemeni Jew. And he was being asked about Jewish communities in America. Sort of, how do you like them? What do you think about Jewish communities in America, right? And his sort of paraphrasing his response, he was dissatisfied with them, deeply dissatisfied. And he, Orthodox, very visible Jewish person, and he was dissatisfied with the Jewish communities in this country. And he said about them, he said, these people don't worship God, they worship themselves. He said they taught the Jewish community this, the Jewish community that, what about God? What about the Torah? Like, what happened to our scripture? What happened to our belief? Why is it all about the community? And the idea is that Muslims were starting to fall into some of these same traps and difficulties. When we distance ourselves from our normative commitments and our values, we don't look at ourselves as having any responsibilities morally or ethically in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We continuously leave and abdicate the moral high ground that we're expected to exhibit and that the Prophet ﷺ left as a message behind. This deen is a responsibility. It's an amana in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is an amana in front of Allah. It's a trust that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us. And what we're witnessing today, and this is effectively the contention that I'm making and that hopefully we can try to flesh out over the next 2 days, is why is this happening? What is this a result of? And the argument that I'm proposing is that it's not, I think at times we get wrapped around the axle because it's a particular TV show or a particular individual or a certain internet site or whatever, right? These types of things may contribute to the zeitgeist that we feel. But the type of indoctrination that we've become sort of subject to is something that begins at a very, very young age here. Right? There's a particular paradigm and set of values that we're taught often unwittingly and unconsciously from the time that we begin school here. And that's 9 to 5 or 7 to 3 or whatever your school hours were, right? From kindergarten through college. Every single day, this is what you're being exposed to. You're being exposed to a specific set of values, a specific set of ideas, a specific set of principles about how the world works. And that set of principles and ideas is being reinforced in the media on television. It's being reinforced through culture. It's being reinforced through sports. It's being reinforced everywhere you look. Everywhere you look. And so as Muslims, this isn't really a big surprise because the reality is that if you've been exposed to this as long as you have, number one, you're not very conscientious of it, but number two, it's natural that you're going to bring all of those things that you've imbibed, all of those things you've absorbed over the course of 18, 20, 22, 30 plus years into conversation with your faith. And when you bring it into conversation with your faith, you're going to find your own religion, you're going to find the Quran, you're going to find the Sunnah unimpressive. You're going to find it something difficult, onerous, and unwieldy at times. And so the question for us isn't just about the future of all of us in the room, because that's obviously a significant question. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us all thabat. But it's also about the future in this country for our children and our grandchildren. And that is a very, very existential and important question. It's a very important question to us. What are we going to leave behind? What type of community are we going to leave behind? And I'll sort of close off with this. I didn't have a ton of comments, and like I said, it's past my bedtime. So, but if you look at the trajectory of other religious communities in this country, you see this pattern is having played out. Right? Christian communities have moved very, very far along here, as have Jewish communities now. If you look at what predominates in those circles, they're very hard, reformist, revisionist communities. But one community I was reading about recently is the Evangelical Lutheran Church. The Evangelical Lutheran Church. And one of their biggest celebrities is she's like a priest. I think she's ordained as a minister or something like that. Her name's Nadia Bolz-Weber. Any of you heard of Nadia Bolz-Weber? She's very popular now. She's very difficult to book. She speaks at every single one of their major programs and activities. It's really remarkable to witness. But what's interesting about her, well, there's a lot that's interesting about her. Number one is that she just has tattoos everywhere, right? She's just tattooed everywhere on her body, right? She used to have her own church that she recently left, and because she's become too big to get stuck to her church. She's a huge advocate of the LGBT political movement. She had in her church that she left a minister of fabulousness. That's a real position in the church. A minister of fabulousness who was a drag queen. She frequently uses profanities and ridicules the Bible. You can't listen to any, if she's talking, she's going to cuss. She's probably going to cuss a lot in whatever talk she gives. This is standard par for the course for her. She makes fun of the Bible, the Holy Spirit, Jesus. Anything sacred about Christianity is just up for grabs with her. And she has no hesitation. She's just totally uninhibited talking about this stuff. And yet, despite all of this, her celebrity just grows. It just continues. You have a couple of sort of like old uncles in their community that are like, look, we should stop inviting her, But they're just getting drowned out. She's just getting drowned out. And it's weird. It's unclear what makes her a Christian at all. She actually holds events. Are you all familiar with the concept of purity rings? It's when people in Christianity commit to celibacy before marriage. She holds public events where Christian youth come with their purity rings and they throw them into a fire and they melt them. These are the types of events that she hosts, right? And these are huge events. You can't imagine how many people attend these things. This is the Evangelical Lutheran Church, right? They just had their America's Youth Conference, over 30,000 youth. She was the keynote speaker. She was the keynote speaker for 30,000 Christian youth in the evangelical Christian denomination, right? So when we talk about what's happened in other Christian and Jewish denominations, it's gone very, very far along. It has moved very far along, and most of them have very different ideas now about church, belief, or anything else that would be associated to the sacred. And so as Muslims, we've simply, especially for those of us that are immigrants, we've simply been in this country for a shorter amount of time. And we have managed, for those of us, I came of age in the 90s. For those of us who remember what our Muslim communities were like in the 90s, say this has been less than 2 decades, right? And just look at how far we've moved. Look at how easy it is now for people to ridicule and insult scholars without a moment's hesitation. People, Ahlul Ilm, people of knowledge. They just haven't, there's no ihtiram, there's no respect or no reverence remaining for that type of environment or for those people anymore. Especially on social media, it's just like, I have a page, right? Who really cares? I can post on it, I'll do it, right? Think about the way that our communities talk about our elders. I get very concerned about the way that many Muslim youth talk about their elders now. For those of you who were at Sheikh Jamal's khutbah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala preserve him. He was talking about, he mentioned the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, لَيْسَ مِنَّا مَنْ لَمْ يَرْحَمْ صَغِيرَنَا وَلَمْ يُوَقِّرْ كَبِيرَنَا أو كما قال عليه الصلاة والسلام, that he's not from us who doesn't have mercy on our youth and doesn't respect our elders. That you have to have a healthy level of respect for our elders, right? And a lot of times I see sort of these new space movements. One of the big irritations that they always message is just like old aunties and uncles. They just can't stand them. And look, uncles, they're not always easy to deal with. Wallahi, I get it, trust me. I'm not, it's not like I haven't been in a masjid before or dealt with aunties and uncles, and especially ones that are tough. But if you've ever had to deal with elders in your family, you realize that when people get old, they just become more difficult. That's a function of life. It is a fact of life. As people age, they become more difficult. I've seen this in my own grandparents. My grandmothers, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala preserve them, my grandfathers, Allah yarhamuhuma. But people get old, that's just what happens. They get a little more set in their ways, and a healthy community respects those people because they recognize that despite their shortcomings, there's immense wisdom in them. And there's immense reward and tolerating them and respecting them even when they're wrong, showing them gentleness, showing them care, recognizing that one day you're going to be in their shoes too. You're going to be this old, dotty uncle or auntie in the community at some point. And so these are the types of values that we have to try to reinstill in our communities. These are the types of convictions that we have to try to recapture in an environment in which it's becoming increasingly difficult to hold on to it. So that's all I had for tonight. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us from a community that's able to participate and practice our faith with resolve, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala always keeps our qibla firmly focused towards Him, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala provides in us the strength to recognize that power comes in putting our heads on the floor to Him Azza wa Jal and not to anything else. So I don't know if anyone has any questions, comments, quibbles or qualms, but if you do, you can open the floor maybe. Sheikh Farhan. I may not be able to see you, there's a big glare, and so I haven't been avoiding the audience, I just didn't want the glare. So